Great. My name is Jo. I'm a barista and assistant coordinator at Union Street, and we're really fortunate to have managed to grab a bit of Lewis's time. Lewis is running to be Labour's candidate for the South Yorkshire mayoral elections. Lewis, I was thinking that for any Labour members who feel completely out of the loop, and there are some of them, what are the South Yorkshire mayoral elections and what does it mean for our region?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jo. But alongside the local elections in Sheffield next May, we'll also get a vote to elect. It's actually going to be the first mayor of South Yorkshire. So 4 years ago, we elected Dan Jarvis as the mayor of the Sheffield City region. But the devolution settlement, unlike Greater Manchester or even like London and Wales, which have been in place for decades, the devolution arrangement wasn't even sort of set up here. So what Dan's been doing over the last 4 years is setting up this South Yorkshire mayoral authority, and Labour members are choosing who our candidate will be to stand in the May local elections for that post.
Fantastic. And there's a key deadline coming up this week. Can you explain what that is?
Yes, probably to the relief of all four of us on the shortlist. This week is the close of ballots for Labour's internal selection. So it's like a sort of a US primary for Labour members. And so by this time next week, Labour will have a candidate and we can move on from the selection process and start going out and campaigning with the wider public.
Brilliant. And so what's your take on why it's important? What's at stake in this contest, do you think?
Well, like I say, I think that the South Yorkshire devolution process has been, it's been complicated, and that's partly because of the way that the government, starting with George Osborne, their devolution programme was a sort of knee-jerk reaction to Scottish independence. It wasn't a considered rollout of powers, and so it's a patchwork. Greater Manchester has got health, the West Yorkshire Mayor has got policing. The South Yorkshire Mayor is a much narrower range of powers around transport, around the economy, and around skills and adult education. But I think that what's so important about selecting the Labour candidate and then for the public selecting the mayor is to select somebody who's ambitious to use those powers to the max to make a difference for the people of South Yorkshire.
So speaking of that, it'd be good to hear about some of your policies. I know one of the points in your manifesto that's maybe receiving the most attention is public ownership of the buses. Can you talk a bit about how you plan to go about that and also what sets your approach apart from other candidates?
Yes, so I look at the bus service in South Yorkshire today. It's expensive, it's fragmented, it's unreliable. Even if you're lucky enough to live upon a bus route, you can't rely on the bus turning up. The workers were facing a real terms pay cut until Unite the Union led stagecoach bus drivers out on strike, and they won a pay rise that will keep up with inflation. And for me, those are problems that can't be solved by getting the bus companies to sit around a table and to agree to run the buses better. The root cause of our problems with buses is that this is a public service, and it's a public service that 30 years ago was privatised in the most Wild West sort of way, only to see bus companies like Stagecoach in particular come in, strip South Yorkshire of money, assets, and then turn around to the public sector and complain that there's declining passenger numbers, that their buses are old and won't meet the clean air standards. And they ask the public to bail them out on passenger revenue and to bail them out on so-called unprofitable routes and to bail them out on buying clean vehicles that don't pollute people and kill them. And so for me, you don't resolve that by having another go at talking to these companies. You do it by bringing the services back under the mayoral authority. So I, as mayor, would take responsibility for running the buses and the trams and be able to bring them into a joined up service. And the efficiencies that you could have from not having a Stagecoach 52 competing against a First 52 competing against a Stagecoach tram, if that was part of an integrated network, you could actually run it a lot more efficiently than the private sector can. So there's this idea that the private sector is the most efficient way of doing things. What the private sector is most efficient at is extracting the profit from a public service, not running it. The other candidates in this selection and the other candidates in the election in May have been talking about the first step in my plan, which is franchising, where you close down the private market essentially and appoint companies to run buses on a contract. And that's the first step in my plan. It's an essential step to take to close down the Wild West of the free market. But for me, once you've got the power to choose which company operates in South Yorkshire, it's got to be a public sector provider, because we know that it's only in public ownership that the people who work for a public service can flourish in their attitude to delivering a public service. And if they've got a manager breathing down on their necks because they're worried about profit levels for a privatised public service, it's never going to work. But the other thing, finally, that I think would be especially of interest to Union Street members is that I don't think that bringing something, nominally under state ownership is the end of the process. For me, that's the beginning of a process. Once you've done that, you can then be creative about how you run that company. And so I think that if the Mayor of South Yorkshire, if the mayoral combined authority owns the bus company and the tram company, they're doing that on behalf of the people of South Yorkshire. And so the thing to do is to have a cooperative form of management in which those people who own it through the mayor get to nominate passenger nominated directors to the board of directors, and then also who sit alongside worker employee nominated directors at the board of directors. Because I think that passengers and workers know a lot better than anybody sat in an office trying to work it out theoretically how to make bus services better. And I would also want to see the groups of people who are particularly reliant on public transport, like elderly people, disabled people, have reserved spaces, so they're also at that board of directors and downwards having those discussions.
Thanks for that insight, Lewis. Going from a policy that's quite widely discussed to one that I think might be an issue people know a bit less about, you really spotlight nature restoration. Can you fill us in on why that's a priority for you?
Well, absolutely. It's a part of, when we talk about a Green New Deal or decarbonisation, it's very easy, to just focus on the sort of green industrial revolution side, how we're going to be manufacturing with wind turbines or other such technology. But actually a massive part of how we're ruining the planet, a massive part of how we can save the planet, is by responsible management of our natural landscapes and the ecosystems that they protect. And it's particularly important in South Yorkshire because we are on the doorstep of the Peak District, and the Pennine Moorlands is sometimes called the rainforest of the UK, because in terms of carbon, the peat soil that's on those moorlands contains a huge amount of carbon and can lock it away for millions of years. But what is currently happening is grouse shooters and their gamekeepers burn the moorlands on a regular basis to keep the vegetation low so their grouse can multiply and then people can go and shoot the grouse. And that devastates the peat. It releases carbon into the air, but it also means that more water runs off the hills rather than getting soaked up in the peat. So when you see devastating flooding, like in the Lower Don Valley, in Rotherham, in Doncaster, we saw a fish lake a few years ago, that's water that's rushed off the Peak District because you've had burning of the peatlands. And so what nature restoration is about is saying, yes, you can put up concrete flood barriers, and that's important, but there's only, you can't put up enough concrete flood barriers if you carry on managing the natural landscape in such a devastating way. And so I'd want to use the Mayor's powers to set up a land commission, which surveys land in South Yorkshire, identifies who owns it, identifies how it should be managed in the public and the environmental interest, and then set about a plan to implement that. And I would see, chasing grouse shooters off the moors and allowing our peat bogs to regenerate and lock away carbon and lock away water is not just good for nature in and of itself, but like I say, has benefits for the whole of South Yorkshire.
Brilliant, thank you. So from your time as a city councillor, you'll be very familiar with lack of adequate government funding. Is it your plan to partially use your role as a platform to campaign for that to change, or are there other ways you've thought of to address that?
So first and foremost for me is, I think we have to use all the resources that we currently have. Like I say, be imaginative, be ambitious, be creative. So the mayor has actually got a distinct power compared to local authorities, is that the mayor's got a 30-year budget of £30 million a year. And so using that 30-year budget, it enables you to borrow against that and make long-term investments. So for example, the bus and the tram, like I say, I think that we can run the bus and the tram more efficiently in the public sector than in the private sector. So if you borrow and invest in a publicly owned bus company, you can make that money back to be spent on other things in the future. And so I'm pretty confident by using the mayor's borrowing powers and making good investments that we can achieve a lot of these aims that are otherwise written off as unachievable. You know, there's no way that the mayor's got enough money to make up for the shortfall in council budgets, but what we can do is provide a sort of additional benefit in infrastructure like public transport that helps the wider South Yorkshire economy improve and recover. And the other idea related to that is that I think that there's a big potential for a community share issue, essentially, a Green New Deal bond issued by the mayor, which allows those individuals and businesses who have saved up money during the pandemic, and, you know, some people who have been furloughed and working from home and have fully insulated their houses will be saving up money. And if they can invest it in a Green New Deal bond, a South Yorkshire Green New Deal bond, then that means that other people in South Yorkshire and other businesses in South Yorkshire that need even, you know, the simplest forms of insulation like double glazing can borrow from that. And we see a virtuous sort of circle of mutuality where people can invest in a way that benefits their neighbours. And that is a way we can use the resources we've already got in South Yorkshire to be better. Similarly, on public procurement, I would want to be working alongside the other big public sector providers to make sure we had a community wealth building strategy by which we were buying from local South Yorkshire providers, boosting those businesses and cooperatives. And that then regenerates the economy, raises local business rates, and eventually sees a much better return than this idea that if you can buy the cheapest thing possible from as far away as possible, that's better. That's short-term thinking. So I'm quite, whereas councils are in an incredibly tricky position, I'm quite confident that there are ways to raise the money to do what we need to do at a regional level.
Thanks, Lewis. Are there any other parts of your manifesto that you'd really like to highlight that you think Union Street members might not have caught on to?
Well, absolutely on that front, it's the commitment that we've made to cooperation and to mutuality, which, is something that will be innate to members of Union Street. We need a greener economy. We need a stronger economy. But I think the essence of that is promoting cooperatives and mutual ownership and employee ownership, because that's a way both in which you see the benefits spread more widely. But as I've said, and it's something like the publicly owned bus company, I think a cooperative form of management can really benefit the decision making of that company itself. And so that idea, and the fantastic community that's at Union Street, I think people will recognise that. And yeah, I just want to also say, a big thank you to everybody at Union Street for hosting us during the campaign. It's been a bit weird because of COVID, and if we're successful next week, you'll be seeing a lot more of us. But it's, Union Street has been a real asset to all sorts of progressive movements, from in the environment to the cooperative movement in Sheffield. And we're really glad that we've based our campaign there.
It's been great to have you. So where can people go if they do want to follow your campaign or get a bit more information about your manifesto, maybe?
Well, the first place to go would be my website, lewisdagnall.org.uk, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and all of that. Like we say, Wednesday lunchtime is the deadline for Labour members. But if I'm successful next Wednesday, that's just the start of a campaign that, leading up to May local elections, will be asking everybody to pitch in to get South Yorkshire moving.
Brilliant. And if anyone's interested in supporting you a bit more, helping out with the campaign, how can they do that?
Well, the main thing we're trying to do at the moment is to speak to and communicate with Labour Party members. So either communicating with them on social media or telephoning them. And on my website is a link to people who want to sign up and volunteer. If you're excited by what we've been talking about, then this is really an opportunity to put into practice.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for speaking to us, Lewis.
No, thank